The INFJ who replays conversations for 3 days after they happen is not overthinking. They are searching for something. The INFJ who eventually stops is not thinking less. They found it, and what they found was never in the conversation. There is a specific experience that almost every INFJ knows intimately, and almost nobody outside this type fully understands. You finish a conversation. It might have been fine. It might have been difficult. It might have been completely ordinary. A work interaction, a brief exchange with someone you care about, something that lasted 12 minutes and mattered, apparently, to nobody else involved. And then it comes with you, into the evening, into the space before sleep, into the next morning while you are doing something completely unrelated. You are turning it over, replaying specific sentences, examining the tone of something said, wondering whether what you said landed the way you intended, whether you misread something, whether something was communicated that you did not mean to communicate. Most people call this overthinking and tell you to stop. This video is not going to tell you to stop. It is going to tell you what you are actually doing, and why a specific version of the INFJ eventually stops doing it without anyone having to tell them to. Here is the thing that complicates the simple narrative. The INFJ who stops replaying conversations has not become less sensitive. They have not become less perceptive. They have not decided that other people's experiences of them no longer matter. Something more specific happened. Their internal reference point shifted, and once it shifts, the replay loses most of its function. Because the function was always about the reference point, not the conversation. If this channel keeps taking you somewhere you did not expect to go, subscribe. That is the only intention here. Let's get into it. 1. What the replay actually is. It is not what most people diagnose it as. The standard diagnosis of conversation replay is anxiety. You are worried about how you came across. You are afraid of judgment. You have social anxiety that manifests as post-interaction rumination. This diagnosis is not entirely wrong. Anxiety is often present in the replay, but it is a downstream effect rather than the primary mechanism. And treating the anxiety as the cause rather than the symptom produces the wrong intervention every time. What is actually happening in conversation replay is something more specific and, once you see it, more understandable. The INFJ is running a quality check against an external standard. They are asking, consciously or not, whether what they said and did in that conversation was received accurately, whether it was fair, whether it reflected who they intend to be, whether the other person's experience of the interaction matches the INFJ's own assessment of what was true about it. The replay is not random rumination. It is a coherent, purposeful audit. The problem is the reference point the audit is using. When the INFJ replays a conversation to assess whether they came across well, they are using the other person's imagined perception of them as their primary reference point. They are trying to reconstruct how they appeared from the outside, to someone whose inner experience they cannot fully access, based on behavioral signals they observed during the interaction and are now analyzing in retrospect. This is an inherently unstable process. The data is incomplete. The reconstruction is partial. The imagined external perception is not an accurate mirror. It is a simulation built from incomplete information and filtered through the INFJ's own anxieties. The audit can never complete because the reference point it is using is not fixed. It shifts with every new angle the replay examines, and so the replay continues. A researcher studying rumination in highly sensitive individuals found that the content of post-interaction replay in this population was almost never simple worry about social rejection. It was consistently organized around questions of accuracy and fairness. Did I represent myself truthfully? Did I contribute something of real value to this interaction? Did I treat this person with the quality of care they deserved? These are not the questions of someone who is socially anxious. They are the questions of someone who has a sophisticated internal moral standard and is using an unstable external reference to check whether they met it. 2. The specific neurological loop that keeps the replay running. There is a neurological reason the replay does not simply stop when the INFJ has reviewed the conversation once. It is not that the INFJ lacks discipline or cannot redirect their attention effectively. It is that the brain structure driving the replay is running a process that has a specific completion condition, and that condition is never met by the replay itself. which is why the replay runs indefinitely. The process is driven primarily by the anterior cingulate cortex, the brain region responsible for error detection and conflict monitoring. This region activates when the brain perceives a mismatch between expected and actual outcomes, and it stays active until the mismatch is resolved. In the INFJ's case, the mismatch that triggers activation is not always a clear, nameable error. It is often a quality of incompleteness, a felt sense that the conversation did not fully communicate what the INFJ intended, that the other person's experience of the interaction might diverge from what was actually true about it, that something real was present in the exchange that did not fully make it into the visible record of the exchange. The anterior cingulate registers this as unresolved. It stays active. It recruits the default mode network, already running at higher baseline levels in the INFJ than in most people, and the default mode begins its integration and meaning-making process, returning repeatedly to the unresolved material in search of resolution. The replay is the default mode, attempting to close a loop that the anterior cingulate opened. The reason the loop does not close is that the resolution the anterior cingulate is looking for, confirmation that the mismatch has been resolved, that the incompleteness has been filled, cannot be provided by the replay itself. The replay produces more analysis of the original data, but it cannot generate new data. It cannot tell the INFJ how the other person actually experienced the interaction. It cannot confirm whether the intention was received accurately. It is a closed system, reviewing a fixed dataset, looking for a resolution the dataset does not contain. The INFJ who understands this stops trying to run the replay harder or more thoroughly. The thoroughness is not the missing ingredient. The missing ingredient is an entirely different relationship between the INFJ and the question the replay is trying to answer. 3. What the INFJ is looking for that the replay cannot provide. The replay is a search, and like any search, it has a specific object it is looking for. The problem is not the searching. It is that the object of the search is not located where the search is looking. What the INFJ's conversation replay is most fundamentally searching for is confirmation that they were, in that interaction, genuinely themselves. Not well received, genuinely themselves. The anxiety underneath the replay is almost never simply, "I hope they liked me." It is something more interior than that and more demanding. It is, "I need to know whether what I offered in that conversation was the real version of me or a performance of me, whether I was present or managed, whether I contributed something true or something calibrated for reception." This is a legitimate and important question. It is the right question to be asking. The issue is that it cannot be answered from the outside in. You cannot establish whether you were genuinely yourself in an interaction by reconstructing how you appeared to the other person. The external reconstruction is operating in the wrong direction. Genuine self-expression is an interior fact, not an exterior one. Whether you are being real is something you can only verify from inside your own experience of the interaction, not from the simulated external perspective the replay is using as its primary data source. A woman who described working through this pattern, not an INFJ researcher, but someone who had spent years in the replay cycle, and then spent years studying why it eventually stopped, said something I have been thinking about since. She said, the replay stopped when she shifted the question from "did they receive me accurately" to "was I actually present in that conversation?" The first question has no accessible answer. The second question has one. She was there. She knows whether she was present or managed. That knowledge does not require the other person's testimony. This is the entire hinge of the difference between the INFJ who replays for days and the INFJ who does not. Not a difference in sensitivity. Not a difference in how much they care about other people. Not a difference in the sophistication of their self-awareness. A difference in the location of the reference point against which the interaction is being assessed. One is located outside. One is located inside, and only one of those locations produces a resolution the brain can actually use to close the loop. 4. Why some INFJs stop and what actually happens before they do. The shift from an INFJ who replays to one who does not is not a decision. I want to be clear about this, because most advice about rumination is structured as though it is a decision. Redirect your attention, practice mindfulness, choose not to engage the thoughts. These approaches have some utility. They do not produce the core shift. The core shift is structural, not volitional. It happens when something changes in how the INFJ relates to their own internal authority. The INFJ who replays for days is, at some level, still treating the external world as the primary arbiter of who they are, not in a conscious, philosophical way, in a practical, moment-to-moment way that is mostly invisible to them while it is running. Their sense of whether they were good in a situation, whether they were honest, caring, present, fair, is being partially sourced from outside, from how they are being perceived, from whether the other person seems to have received them accurately, from the social feedback the interaction produced. And when the social feedback is ambiguous, when the conversation ended without a clear external confirmation of the INFJ's internal assessment of how it went, the replay begins. Before the shift happens, there is almost always a period that could be described as evidence accumulation. The INFJ builds, over years of this process, an increasingly complete record of the replay's limitations. They replay a conversation thoroughly and with genuine rigor, and the replay produces no resolution. They worry about how something landed, and later discover their worry was either entirely unfounded or entirely beside the point. They spend 3 days examining an exchange and realize eventually that the time spent had no effect on the outcome of the interaction or the relationship or anything else external to the INFJ themselves. The replay did not improve anything. The absence of replay would have produced no worse result. The cost was entirely theirs, and the benefit was essentially nil. At some point, this accumulates into a specific kind of exhaustion. Not exhaustion with caring about people or interactions, exhaustion with the specific mechanics of using the other person's imagined perception as the primary instrument for self-assessment. The exhaustion itself is the beginning of the shift. What gets built in its place is the rest of this video. 5. The internal reference point that makes the replay unnecessary. The INFJ who no longer replays conversations for days has not stopped caring about how their interactions land. They have developed a primary reference point for self-assessment that does not depend on external confirmation to produce resolution. And that reference point, when it is genuinely established rather than merely aspired to, makes the replay structurally redundant rather than simply optional. The reference point is this: I know whether I was honest in that conversation. I know whether I was present. I know whether I brought what was real rather than what was managed. I know whether I treated the person across from me with the quality of care I am capable of bringing. These are interior facts. They are directly accessible. They do not require the other person's testimony or the reconstruction of their imagined experience of the interaction. The INFJ was there. The INFJ has access to their own experience of the interaction in a way that nobody else does, and in a way that no amount of replay can substitute for. This sounds simpler than it is to actually live, because building a primary reference point that is genuinely internal, not theoretically internal, not internally aspired to while practically sourced from outside, requires a level of confidence in one's own perception and one's own values that most INFJs spend years building and many never fully reach. The INFJ whose interior self-assessment is still partially contingent on external validation is the INFJ for whom the replay has genuine function. It is trying to source the external component the internal assessment still depends on. The INFJ who has genuinely shifted, who can close the assessment loop from the inside because the inside is sufficient, does not replay in the same way because the replay has no work left to do. The question was asked and answered before the conversation was over. Was I honest? Yes. Was I present? Yes. Did I bring something real? Yes. These answers are available to the INFJ immediately after the interaction, from their own direct experience of it, without any external data required. The loop closes. The anterior cingulate gets its resolution signal. The default mode moves on. 6. The specific things that accelerate the shift in practice. I want to be practical here, rather than staying in the theoretical, because the shift I have been describing is real and it is buildable. It is not reserved for a special category of INFJ who simply arrives at self-possession without effort. There are specific practices and experiences that consistently accelerate the development of a stable internal reference point, and I want to name them with the specificity they deserve. The first is the deliberate practice of assessing your own interactions immediately after they end. before the replay begins, using only internal criteria. Not how did they receive me, but was I honest? Not did I come across well, but was I present? Not did they understand me, but did I offer something true? This practice, done consistently and over time, trains the brain to complete its post-interaction audit using internal data rather than external reconstruction. The assessment circuit gets rewired through repetition. The brain learns that the resolution it needs is available from the inside and stops seeking it from the outside. The second is the accumulated experience of discovering that the replay was wrong. Every INFJ who has replayed a conversation extensively reached a worried conclusion about how it was received, and then found out through subsequent interaction that the conclusion was inaccurate, has evidence that the external simulation the replay uses as its primary data source is not reliable. Building a conscious record of these instances, not as self-criticism but as evidence review, gives the INFJ specific, verifiable grounds for trusting the internal assessment over the simulated external one. The track record of the internal assessment is almost always better than the track record of the worry. The third, and this is the one that most people skip because it is less comfortable than the others, is the deliberate practice of letting interactions be over when they are over. Not closing them prematurely in your mind through forced redirection. Not replaying them through anxiety. Letting them be complete as they were, good enough as they were, finished as they were, without requiring them to be retrospectively perfect or perfectly understood. The INFJ who develops tolerance for the incompleteness of interactions, for the reality that no conversation is perfectly transmitted or perfectly received, removes the primary trigger for the loop that drives the replay. 7. What the INFJ on the other side of this actually looks like in ordinary life. I want to end with something concrete, because this video has been necessarily abstract in places, and abstract descriptions of interior shifts are only useful when you can recognize them in the actual texture of someone's daily experience. The INFJ who has developed a stable internal reference point and left the replay cycle behind does not look dramatically different from the outside. They are not more confident in the performed, visible way. They are not louder, or more assertive, or more obviously self-possessed. The difference is in the quality of their engagement during interactions, rather than in any visible characteristic of who they are. During conversations, they are more fully present than they used to be, not because they became better at mindfulness, because the portion of their cognitive resources that used to be allocated to the monitoring operation, the ongoing assessment of how they are being received, has been freed up. The conversation gets more of them because the performance management is no longer running. People who know an INFJ before and after this shift consistently notice something. They describe the person as more available in some quality they cannot fully name, less like they are watching themselves as they talk, more like they are simply there. After conversations, they notice the absence of something, not immediately, not dramatically, just at some point the recognition that they are not running the replay. The interaction was had, it was what it was, they were honest in it, they were present in it. It is now over in a way that interactions were not over before, when they continued in the interior for days. The ending is actually an ending. And the space that the replay used to occupy, in the evenings, in the quiet moments, in the pre-sleep processing, is available for something else, for genuine rest, for actual creative thinking, for the quality of interior life that the constant audit was consuming. One person described it as this: I used to spend so much of my life in conversations that had already ended. Now I am mostly in the conversation that is actually happening. It sounds simple. It is not simple to arrive at, but it is accurate. And for the INFJ who reaches it, it is one of the more significant quality of life shifts available, not through external change, but through the slow, specific reorientation of where they locate the authority to say the conversation was enough. 7 layers of a pattern most INFJs live inside for years before they understand what it is actually searching for and what it would mean to finally find it. The replay is not a character flaw. It is a logical consequence of a sophisticated mind using an unstable reference point to answer a question that only an internal reference point can answer. The shift is not about caring less. It is about locating the authority for self-assessment somewhere it can actually produce resolution. You were honest in that conversation. You were present. You brought something real. You do not need the replay to confirm it. You were there. Brainy Quiet Mind. Subscribe. Share this with the INFJ in your life who is still in a conversation that ended 3 days ago. One question for the comments. What is the conversation you have replayed the most in your life? And what were you actually searching for every time you went back to it?